For a culture that has cliched wisdom such as laughter is the best medicine, our outward expression are chuckles, chortles, guffaws, giggles, titters, while reacting to humor should not be so controversial. The fact that humor lies at the center of certain expressions of culture wars, and that even bringing it up in this medium has made at least some of you nervous, points to how critical it is to approach laughter with the sober consideration that all spiritual expressions require. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up some Torah together. I do indeed consider laughter spiritual, but from a specific perspective. The great Amos Oz of blessed memory distilled it perfectly as he opined. A sense of humor is a great cure. I have never once in my life seen a fanatic with a great sense of humor, nor have I seen a person with a sense of humor become a fanatic. At the other end of truth and the emotional spectrum, Oz, in A Tale of Love and Darkness, wrote, "If you have no more tears left to weep, then don't weep, laugh." This not only defines the medicine, but explains quite a bit why Judaism still exists. Looking at laughter today forces us into a room where we can either acknowledge that more than one truth and dialogue can exist in the same space, or the room becomes as hostile as your average civil conversation after the latest tweet by your favorite provocateur. Indeed, the lack of tone and nuance in, 280 characters, has partially led us into these places of hostility, but no more so than the refusal to allow anything other than the worst possible interpretation of anything that is said by anyone who says it while committing the great sin of belonging to another tribe, whichever tribe it is that we and they are representing in our moment of discussion. What we end up with in that room is one side arguing free speech and the other side arguing appropriate respect and sensitivity. As we human beings do have the capability of nuance when it suits us, most of us, at least with our feet held to the fire, will agree that these continua of ideas can be argued either together or separately. If argued together, however, free speech becomes the antipode of respectful speech, which both limits the meaning and subtlety of free speech and respectful speech. Free speech is not very well served when it is forced to become the opposite of respectful speech, while respectful speech is done no great service as well by being forced to be the result of repressed speech. If seen as different lines of discussion, different lines of dialogue, we begin approaching some of the perhaps shocking subtlety that we find in the narrative of the prophetess Sarah. And it shouldn't really surprise us that a discussion about laughter comes out of the Sarah narrative. The name of her son, Isaac, Yitzchak, comes from the Hebrew verb to laugh, litzchok. And Isaac is so named because of the laughter that issued from Sarah when she found out from Malachim, angels, messengers, that she would be giving birth beyond an age where that would normally be possible. The actual passage where she laughs, however, begs a few questions and forces us into perhaps a more nuanced discussion about laughter. It is probably not appropriate to wonder what three-letter exclamations Sarah would have texted had the angels given her the news today and she posted it on Instagram. There is a subtlety in the verses that warrants a closer look. Sarah is eavesdropping when the news is dropped. This detail is important for the setup, not just for the staging, but for the psychological, spiritual, emotional reality of Sarah, who's hearing pretty important news that affects her while the news is not being given to her. We read in Genesis chapter 18, starting in verse 10, "Then one of the angels said, 'I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son.' Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him." Then we get to the next part of the setup, the situational absurdity. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. Sarah's reaction should not be all that shocking. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband? So old?" But ching, this isn't a laugh line only because it's Torah. And Torah is what? Holy? So it can't be hilarious? We usually read Torah in ceremonies of great sobriety and places of oftentimes great formalness. So what? The formalness with which we look at these texts and read these texts then determine what must have been in the hearts and minds and creativity of the people who were inspired, wrote, and edited these texts at the beginning? When did sacred start meaning don't smile? No wonder so many synagogues are half full. Place this in a plot of Seinfeld and we're laughing with Sarah. Now read the next verses in the context of your favorite sitcom, instead of with the straight face and seriousness that we have somehow collectively accepted must be the way to hear our holy texts. Then the Eternal said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Shall I in truth bear a child old as I am?' Is anything too wondrous for the Eternal? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Anything strange going on here at all? And then finally the kicker. Sarah lied, saying, "I did not laugh, for she was frightened." But he replied, "You did laugh." This can play terrifyingly. Or it can play as the end of the first act of a comic opera, people absurdly overhearing and reacting and running through the forest, and then a magical anvil comes from the sky. That's a Rossini joke about absurdity. Yes, it's not funny at all, unless you also hate Rossini. But this entire scene is usually read straight, and so we absorb it with serious facial expressions, when the entire scene could, perhaps should, be having us looking forward to grabbing our popcorn and waiting for the next brilliant yarn that's rolled out there to get us to laugh and look in the mirror and see ourselves for how silly we can be. And yes, how absurd sometimes our dialogue is with. Lest we forget, Isaac means laughter. Yes, it is to honor this moment and remind us of this moment. But can't it also be because we are affectionately supposed to roll our eyes out of the multiplicity of interpretations, the four modalities of Torah and the 70 faces of Torah? Can't one of those faces be one that's giggling? Nachmanides, Ramban, is a great one for trying to parse the Hebrew and see the emotional truths and spiritual truths beneath the everyday words that are used. And through this pretty good understanding of psychology, he notices that the verb to laugh, litzchok, comes from different places of intentionality depending on where the laughter originates in the body. In his commentary on the verse where Sarah has lied, Ramban writes, "Therefore she laughed in herself, in derision. For joyous laughter, expressed in the Hebrew, is originating in the mouth, but laughter originating in the heart is not spoken of as joyous." Not all laughter is created equal. Part of the Torah journey, indeed part of the spiritual journey, is awareness of this. Again, why else would the name of an ancestor, one of our avot, be a name that would constantly remind us of laughter? One of the first truths that Torah is trying to get across, we're still pretty early in the Torah narrative, is something that seems like it should be obvious, but it does move further and further away from the obvious each time the primary use of laughter in ourselves and society is to tear down rather than to lift up, rather than to apply the medicine that heals. In one of the more elevated and interesting Facebook posts that I have seen on this subject in the last few years, a dear friend, an intellectual, a talented playwright, pointed out, possibly slightly more bluntly than I would be able to get away with in a sermon, use of the laugh react to mock a statement of view with which you don't agree is one of the most craven social media behaviors, mostly because it replaced civil discourse with bleeding guffaws of a barely literate rabble, but also because it makes it harder to use it for its intended purpose of expressing amusement when someone makes a deliberately amusing post. Like the different connotations of litzchok in Hebrew, Mr. White's observations point to the obvious, but truly through our behavior ignored reality of weaponizing laughter. If I tell a joke online, I want the like, love, or laughter emoji. The few times that I've gotten the care emoji, I'm assuming that it's a far better comedian making a sweet and pointed commentary on the quality of my humor. I'll go ahead and accept that, knowing that most people would prefer to receive positive feedback rather than mockery. The laugh emoji, instead of positive commentary on a friend's post, becomes the instantaneous derision of a not friend. Here's how it goes. See if this looks or feels familiar. I look in a room. I'm clearly better than those in the room. I pick out my perception of the least sophisticated argument happening in the room. I strawman it, step in, deride with the bold and brave post of a single laughing face, step out, and go on with my life. Well done, me. What a good and constructive use of a powerful tool. The world is now a better place. Laughter has been a balm for broken hearts for the Jewish people because of the need for absurdity in the face of historical hopelessness. In such a context, humor can come out in extreme ways. It can also become a hallmark of a people. Just look at Purim, a holiday that for modern sensibilities, and late modern sensibilities especially, awakes the exact same passion of the free speech, respectful speech, false dichotomy. The text of Esther includes a genocide. It is horrible. Taken alone by itself and out of context, it's unconscionable. And I would argue that the holiday itself and the text are a profound blowing off of steam from a people who, for most of the last 2,000 years, have needed to blow off steam from within a place of little to no agency. So we build a room one day a year to hide ourselves from prying eyes and ears, where we tell a drunken tale of potence from within an external reality that all too often was impotence. It is funny because we make it funny with silly costumes, plays, and way too much to drink. Those calling for the abolition of the holiday, something that's not new, are completely right about the content of the text, decontextualized, as are those who would call for the continuation of the holiday, based on the universal need to take ourselves and, yes, even our potential misery slightly less seriously, even for a tiny period of time. Are we not stressed? Do we, as humans on this planet in this year, not feel overwhelmed and feeling like we're about to boil over? Both perspectives can both be true and functionally right, but capital T truth only arrives with both of these perspectives meeting each other, shaking hands, entering into a dialogue, trying to understand and, yes, even laugh with each other. Like Shabbat is the antidote for being plugged in 24/7, laughter and Purim as the holiday of absurd laughter are a mere release valve over the very real conditions inside that pressure cooker. With a release valve, that meal coming out is going to be very tasty. Without a release valve, the cooker itself becomes deadly, exactly as those ancient narratives that describe genocide become deadly if they are played straight, removed from mythology and context, and become centered as the only important thing in the telling by either the people who would support the text or tear down the text. It's about more. It's always about more. There's always more discussion to be had. It's always more interesting and complicated than our most passionate position of the moment. All spirituality and spiritual systems are predicated on awareness. Stepping back into that room with those twin dialogues regarding free speech and respectful speech, perhaps the best way to re-enter that room is to have a mirror as we walk in where we can look at our facial expressions and laugh at what we look like in a world where every conversation that we have with someone with whom we disagree devolves as quickly as is possible to the worst possible understanding of what the other person is saying. This, of course, is the very nature of absurdity behind Godwin's law. As we don't actually listen to the other person's concerns and see their concerns in the worst possible light, we are unable to engage in the tools that might make this room an interesting one to stay in for a while. Tool number one is listening. And then after we've listened, listen some more. And then when we chime in, we do it to repeat the point that we've just listened to and absorbed in such a way that the person is forced to respond back to us, wow, I wish I would have phrased it that way. Rappaport's rule number one. If we do this, we might find ourselves looking down both continua, ours and the one being described by the person with whom we're having a conversation. We might start thinking of the implications of both dialogues. What happens when we universalize both our point and the point of the person with whom we're speaking? If our advocacy is free speech, are we ever going to find a limit to that and force it on another when the free speech is aimed at us? And if our advocacy is decency, am I able to define and am I aware the origins of my idea of decency? And am I able to identify if there's anyone on that list who doesn't get to be a beneficiary of decency? We are humans, all of us. Our answers are not going to be congruent if we answer this honestly. There is a tool, albeit perhaps an absurd one, that I call the South Park test. Full disclosure, I have not watched South Park in years, and I'm neither advocating for or not advocating for watching the show. Quite frankly, the tool could also be called the Seinfeld test. Both shows had an aesthetic of either everyone is a target or no one is a target. I am personally aware of Matt Stone and Trey Parker being explicit about this being an underlying aesthetic, so hence they get the name, the South Park test. Over the course of the few seasons that I did watch back in the day, they were bound and determined to offend everyone. Everyone. The second that they avoided a group was the day that their specific type of integrity broke down. Without engaging in details or finger-pointing, 2 high-profile incidents or episodes, at least that I am aware of, pointed to the limits of this. In the case of the first, the show was canceled by the network itself, and the second case ended with a cast member, a longtime cast member, leaving the show. In the second case, up to that point, Matt and Trey had already mocked multiple times just about everyone that there was to mock. And that was just fine with the cast member until the mockery was pointed at the tribe to which that person belonged. Once that happened, suddenly something was off limits. That's us. On either train of conversation in this room, if we wish to elevate the conversation in this room, we first have to acknowledge that on the one side, we have a no-go zone where every one of our spouted ideals stops applying to us. And on the other side, where we break our spoken ideals and have no problem going there. All laughter is not created equal. Sarah and her internal use of the laugh emoji points to one example, and our personal incongruities point to the other. There is no solution while we refuse awareness of our participation in both problematic aspects of laughter. The first iterative question then, the question that we can come back to every year when we hit Parashat Vayera. What is my exception? At what point do I stop free speeching and say, nope, that's too far. You just got me where I live. And if found, how am I going to react when someone touches on my exception? Furthermore, does it matter who it is that's touched on the exception? And if so, why does one person get more benefit of the doubt than another? Or another way to look at the exception is if non-mockery is something clear that I wish to universalize, which groups do I mock anyway? And say, well, it's okay. That's a group that I can mock. If I can follow this train of questions and answer honestly, I have just learned something, and I can ask the final question. What do I wish to shift in order to fully embrace laughter and humor, without finding that my laughter is suddenly ringing hollow through my incongruency? The less pleasant word, of course, is hypocrisy. And when that is what we fill our room with, the room is never elevated. The calls for both free speech and decency can be weaponized, and neither has an ethical base if we call for one or the other and have not become aware of that moment where we say, yeah, but that doesn't apply to me. In the end, the only wisdom I have to offer, if indeed this is wisdom, is that there are many rooms in this world filled with a heck of a variety of a mixture of people. The basic ethics of Judaism says that I have to acknowledge within every one of these rooms, no matter what the room is, that person is filled with neighbors that I'm supposed to love, as well as strangers that I'm required to love, because one, we're part of a universal holiness, and two, we were once the ones on the receiving end of being mocked. That being the case, as I look into rooms that I'm not in, my default position is to treat the people inside as I would want to be treated. And that includes such things as how the laugh emoji is used. On the practical side, some of these rooms are filled with abhorrent speech. Sometimes that abhorrent speech is expressed in the form of humor. If that behavior is abhorrent, yet not criminal, as I am merely a human and not a tzaddik, or a saint, or a bodhisattva, I have no ability to step into that room and effect change. If I did so, I would be trying to change them for the sake of my own ego, or from the chorus of likes from the Hallelujah chorus in my room that already agrees with what I'm going to say. There is no elevation here. And the only potential for change is actually the doubling down that's going to happen in the room that I've stepped into and told them to shut up. And also, those inside that room are on their own spiritual journey, even if I would not necessarily recognize it as having any relationship to the spiritual journey that I'm on. But within any spiritual journey, the person on that journey will themselves come into dialogue with moments where they can learn and be elevated. And I am not the arbiter of that change. Indeed, my actions might make it harder for them to hear their own dialogue with their better selves. This means that the best way that I can express my love for the nitzotzot, for the sparks of holiness that are inside of these human beings, is by choosing not to enter, unless that act of entering is my spiritual path and is not an expression of either ego or anger. All of these rooms, for the first time in history, in a very real way, are all available to peek into, which means we also have an equal opportunity to misunderstand and misinterpret every context of a room that we step into that we don't know anything about, as well as not look in the mirror and realize that if someone were to step into our room, that they might just as easily decontextualize and misinterpret our place of comfort. Until we are able to collectively gain wisdom in this novel moment of universally open rooms, our ability to open ourselves to the most healing and elevating forms of laughter is going to need to come from choosing which rooms we step into and which ones we don't. And which, when we step into, will require the humility of listening before we demand to go up on stage and perform our own stand-up routine after we just arrived. Some of those rooms need to be elevated. True. But are we wise enough and above reproach enough to be the ones to do it? Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next time.